Hello, and welcome to the final Writers Speak event of the academic year. My name is Duncan White, and I convene this series for the Mahindra Humanities Centre. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Katie Kitamura, who will be in conversation with Claire Messud. Before I do the introductions proper, I want to take a moment, though, to say a few words of appreciation about Claire. As many of you know, this is class semester. Sorry, Claire. As many of you know, this is Claire's last semester at Harvard. Now, she will not forgive me if I get sentimental, so suffice to say, we will miss her tremendously, whether it is the students who have had their ways of seeing, thinking and writing transformed by her teaching, or whether it's her colleagues who have benefited immeasurably from the generosity of her intellect and the warmth of her friendship. But what I really want to acknowledge today is Claire's creation of this series, Writers Speak. She founded the series in 2016 and brought writers of the statures of Colm Tóibín, Jennifer Egan, Michael Ondaatje, Hisham Matar, and Yian Li, among many others, to campus. I realise I am preaching to the converted here, but this series, with its commitment to bringing great authors into communion with its devoted readers, has been a delight and a consolation, especially when times are hard. As one of those readers, I invite you to join me in thanking Claire for all the work she did in establishing this series and all that she continues to do to support and enrich the literary community here in Cambridge. It is my great honour to introduce Katie Kitamura. A previous participant in the Writers Speak series, Rachel Kushner, describes Katie as a dizzyingly skilled writer whose fictions always seem to manage two contradictory effects: a supple, seductive surface under which the chaos of minds and repressed realities roil. It's a great description. Her 2009 debut, The Long Shot, is about a dethroned mixed martial arts champion preparing with his coach for a comeback fight, while her second novel, Gone to the Forest, published in 2012, is a tense family drama set in an unnamed colonial country that is on the brink of civil war. In 2017, Katie published A Separation, the first of three thrilling and unnerving novels told from the perspective of women facing a critical rupture in their lives. A Separation is about a woman who travels to a remote part of Greece in search of her missing husband, from whom she recently separated. If A Separation played with the mystery genre, her next novel, Intimacies, published in 2001, that can't be right. 2020. Played with the genre of the courtroom drama. Here, the protagonist is an interpreter at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, who is assigned to a case involving a prominent politician accused of war crimes. Her most recent novel, published this month, is Audition, a tense and beguiling novel about an accomplished actress whose life is unsettled by a young man with strange claims upon her. In an early review, The Guardian asked rhetorically if there is a better writer at work in America today. Katie's work has many devotees, famously including Barack Obama, who listed Intimacies as one of his favourite novels of that year. She's been awarded the Rome Prize in Literature and a number of prominent fellowships, including the Guggenheim Fellowship last week. Alongside her writing, Katie teaches at the Creative Writing Program at New York University. In conversation with Katie today is, of course, the wonderful Claire Messud. Claire is the author of 7 books of fiction, including The Emperor's Children, The Woman Upstairs, and The Burning Girl. In 2020, she published Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write, subtitled An Autobiography Through Essays. Her most recent novel is This Strange Eventful History, a brilliant fictionalization of Claire's own family history that was longlisted for the Booker Prize. Claire is the recipient of a Guggenheim and also Radcliffe Fellowship, the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts, and she's a senior lecturer here on fiction in the English department at Harvard. Before we begin, please double-check your cell phones and switch to silent. There will be opportunities for questions at the end. Please wait for the microphone to be passed. Mary will be circulating to make sure that we can all hear the questions that you'd like to ask Katie and Claire after they have spoken. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Katie Kitamura and Claire Messud.
Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Katie. It's just so marvelous to have you here. Also, did you mention the Cullman Fellowship as well? Katie just got a Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, in addition to the Guggenheim. Yes, very exciting. And we're here to talk about Audition, which is just published. I'm showing you the beautiful cover. I thought Katie is going to, I hope, read for us, but I thought perhaps we could take just a moment, Katie, and you could maybe set up this novel a little bit. This actress speaking to us. There are two parts. I don't know how much you would like to say, but maybe a little context about where she is and what she's up to.
Yeah, I would love to do that. And it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Duncan, and thank you, Claire. And I think we're all united in this room in our absolute adoration of Claire Messud. Although you could, I know you were going to make that face. You could walk into really almost any room with any reader or writer, and you would all be united in that love of Claire. So I'm so happy to be here with you. I'll say just a couple of words, I guess, about the book. The first moment when I kind of had the idea for the book was when I saw a headline that read, "A stranger told me he was my son." And I was very, very captivated by that sentence, even more than the kind of narrative explanations that I suspected would be contained in the article. I was really preoccupied with the kind of tension between stranger and son, these two terms that seemed mutually exclusive. And that tension seemed productive in some way. And I thought that I wanted to write a novel that was located inside of that. And for a long time, I couldn't really figure out how exactly to do it. And then I was going for a walk with a friend who has a son who's older than my children. And I recited the headline, and she said to me, "That's just a description of parenthood. Every single time my son comes home from college, it's like a stranger has walked into the home." And that was when I had the powerful sense that what I wanted to write was a novel about certain universal and very common experiences of marriage, of parenthood, of making art, of love, that nonetheless seem to contain mutually exclusive, incommensurate aspects to themselves. And so that in this novel, which is very much, I think, continuous with, in particular, these two novels that I wrote before Separation and Intimacies, which all three of the novels have unnamed first-person female narrators. All three characters work in the field of interpretation in some way. One is translator, one is a simultaneous interpreter. In this novel, the character is an actor. But I think the difference with this novel is I decided to try to directly enact that sense of incommensurability into the structure of the novel itself. So the novel opens with a young man, much younger, coming to the narrator, who's an actor who's in rehearsals for a play, and he says to her, "I think I'm your son." And then kind of from there, two separate realities unfold, which are mutually exclusive. The novel is split in two. In the first half, he is a stranger who she nonetheless becomes kind of enraptured by. And in the second half, he is in fact her son. So that's the basic structure of the book.
Thank you so much. As you were speaking, I was thinking that the incommensurability of, the paradoxical nature of the statement is, of course, for men, not a problem. I mean, Martin Amis had somebody come up and say, I'm your daughter, by the way, right?
Yes.
So, but for a mother, right? Yes. For a woman, that's not.
And it's interesting because I think I've been quite interested in flipping gender in some of the tropes of narrative. So in A Separation, it's a missing persons. So when I was writing that novel, I was very preoccupied by the fact that so many thrillers and detective novels open with the body of a dead woman, and it's always, it kind of slowly luxuriates over like a dead woman, and then you often pivot to a male character who is going to discover what happened to the woman. And so in A Separation, I was determined to have a dead man instead at the heart at the heart of the novel. And so similarly with this one, I mean, I think the kind of the commonality of this idea that a man could have a stranger come and say, "I'm your child," and it would open up ideas of patrimony. I think here by flipping it, you run up against an actual impossibility, which was much more interesting to me.
Yes.
In some way.
Would you?
Okay, yeah. I'm just going to read a little bit. You don't need to know very much. Well, I think it'll be about 8 to 9 minutes, just so you know, because I know it's nice to count down until the end. All you need to know is that it's the central character, the narrator, is walking to rehearsal with Xavier, who is a young boy, and Anne is the name of the director of the play. Xavier asked if I'd been able to immerse myself in my new part, if that process had taken place, and I looked up at him, startled out of my thoughts. He was gazing at me with a placid expression, not in the least as if he were asking a sensitive question. And yet, he had touched upon something that was in fact a vulnerability. He had found with unerring intuition something that was now beginning to trouble me. I wondered how innocent the question was, if Anne had said something to him, if she could also tell that things were not progressing as they should. Perhaps that was even the reason why he had been waiting at the corner, outside the cafe, where I always picked up a coffee on my way into rehearsal. Perhaps all this time, it was Anne who had sent him. It would have been fair for her to be concerned. We were now 3 weeks into rehearsal, and I'd had an unusually long time to prepare, and yet I still felt myself too much to be playing a part. I couldn't seem to locate the center of the role. This wasn't necessarily unusual. In the past, there had been plenty of parts that had continued to elude me, even as the work as a whole improved, whether through my own failing, or a failing in the writing, or the direction, or something else altogether. The alchemy was particular, and the truth was that there were many occasions when it went awry, or did not cohere. I had come to see it as something of a crapshoot. You never knew if this would be the one when everything would come together, or if it would fall by the wayside, another disposable performance, the detritus of a soon-to-be-forgotten artistic endeavor. But in the case of this part, this production, I had every reason to hope for the best. Not only was I working with Anne, but the play had been written by a playwright I had long admired. She was a young woman, exceptionally brilliant. I had seen an early production of hers at a small theater downtown that seated no more than 80 people. The theater was half empty the night I went, but even in a half-empty theater with a cast of unknowns, I knew that she was an extraordinary talent. Tension grew out of every scene, scenes in which nothing took place and people said very little, and yet the pressure grew and grew, so that by the end of the play, I realized I'd been in a sickening state of unease for some time, and when I emerged from the theater, I was simultaneously invigorated and physically exhausted, every nerve in my body still standing on end. Of course, I immediately called my agent and asked her to arrange a meeting, and not too long after that I spoke to Anne, who had also seen the young playwright's work and been similarly impressed. However, everyone had been by then, so it was by no means assured that we would have the opportunity to work with her, much less that she would make a new piece with us. But as it turned out, after nearly 2 years of expressions of intent and little more, she suddenly called me and said she had something. When she sent me the play, I knew from the first page that this was the part for me, the one that came along only very rarely, and that if I was patient and careful, it could form the basis of the best work I had ever done. But then, after the first table read, and after the early rehearsals and the later rehearsals, and even as Anne and the playwright herself extolled the virtues of my interpretation, even as the pieces began to fall into place and the shape of the performances began to emerge, my own, and also those of the rest of the cast, and even as I began to see in the not-too-distant future the point at which the emergence would cease and the structure of the work begin to ossify, so that although some movement would remain possible, its essential parameters would be set, even then, I had the sense that I was still too much clinging to the shore. The part, the world of it, continued to elude me, and I knew that the window of opportunity was closing, that I had to make some shift within myself, or the role would slip away. I had been silent for some time now, and I said, "There's only 1 more week of rehearsal, and then we go into tech." "Anne said that you're already excellent," said Xavier. "I'm not where I need to be. I'm waiting for something to happen, and time is running out." I moved my head uneasily. I didn't know why I was telling Xavier this. "There's always the chance that the breakthrough takes place later," I said, "but I'm starting to fear I won't get there." "It's not through any fault of Anne's," I added. "The play itself is wonderful. It's me." "But what if you are actually good? Does it matter how you feel? Of course it matters, I said quickly. But even as I spoke, I found myself uncertain. Did it matter? It mattered in the sense that the work was what counted, not the activity that surrounded it, the energy that collected or dissipated upon its reception. But I didn't know how to separate the work from its effect. I recalled a recent film centered on a performance that had seemed to me so extraordinary it had recast everything I knew about the actor, whom I had previously found rather uninteresting despite his storied career and reputation. As he had gotten older, there was a palpable laziness to his work, the sense that he could no longer be bothered to rouse himself to his former heights. He was always playing some previous version of himself, the version that had won the acclaim and sealed the reputation. But in this film, in Salvation, he had produced a performance of rare depth and complexity, recalling the promise he showed at the very start of his career, when he still seemed moved by ambition and curiosity. He played each scene with painful caution, reaching out to touch a table, a counter, as if seeking to be grounded. I could feel the character's turmoil in almost every instant on screen. He would look down and then up again, and there would be an expression of such confusion on his face that it was not too much to say that my heart broke as I watched him. I had to admit that I'd been wrong. He was in fact an actor of remarkable subtlety and commitment, and I subsequently agreed to work with him. But soon after we arrived on set, to my surprise, I found that he was as vacuous and vain as I had previously thought, and as we began to rehearse, I felt a jolt of distress. He seemed to have little sense of the scene, and he knew none of his lines. He kept dipping his head down into the script and mouthing the words to himself, for all the world as if he had never so much as seen them in his life. I felt frustration, and even anger. It was hard not to take it as a sign of disrespect. After all, he was wasting my time, and the time of everyone on set. He was even wasting his own time, of which, I remember thinking maliciously, he did not have a great deal remaining. Perhaps sensing my exasperation, the director pulled me aside and said that the actor was having trouble memorizing his lines and was unlikely to recall any of them, and that I should be prepared for this. I shouldn't expect matters to improve. I looked at him in confusion, and he explained that he had spoken to Stan, the director of Salvation. I should have told you earlier, he said, but the truth is, I only just found out. He can't remember his lines. He turned up on the set of Salvation every day without knowing any of them. I gave a short laugh of disbelief, and the director raised his hand, as if to stop me. At first, Stan thought it was simply lack of focus and preparation, but quite soon he realized that it was beyond his control. He really couldn't retain the words for even the minute between looking at the script and delivering them from inside the scene. So they stuck notes with the lines on every surface of the set and muddled through. Do you remember the scene in the kitchen when he's running his hands across the counter? That's him looking for his note. Same in the bathroom scene. I stared at the director in disbelief. As it turned out, he continued wryly, the result was genuinely remarkable, and it was on that basis that I cast him in this movie, the one we're now making, or trying to, at least. It was only later that I discovered the source of the performance's strength, which is the fact that it is no performance at all. The confusion that you see on screen is completely real. You're looking at a man lost, with no sense of what the story is, trapped inside the scene, with the camera lens staring at him. You're watching a man who is seeing his life and his career drift away. But why didn't Stan tell you, I asked. It works for that movie, I admit. And here I stopped and nodded to myself. I admit it works very well for that. But for this, I know, the director said. When Stan told me, I was furious. Why didn't you warn me, I asked him. And Stan simply said that he would have felt as if he were betraying the actor. For such a story to become public, for such a story even to circulate within the industry would be fatal. It wasn't that he felt especially loyal to the actor. He was more than happy to complain about his vanity and his bullheadedness. It was in this one regard that he felt a kind of fidelity. He had even attempted to hide the degree of the actor's impairment from the crew. He had not said that the actor was suffering from dementia, but instead claimed that he had refused to learn his lines, that he was lazy and stupid, words of abuse that were in fact designed to protect the actor, to prevent the others from guessing the truth. You see, the director said, in his way, Stan loved him. Yes, I said, or perhaps it was the performance he loved and the process of extracting it. On some level, what Stan had done was ruthless and unconscionable. He must have known that he had crossed a moral line, and I couldn't help but feel that it was a secret of that transgression, not the aging actor, not even the reputation of the film. that Stan was so eager to protect. In any case, our film had not replicated the success of Salvation, although the actor continued to muddle through, and work came to him as frequently as before. Probably even now he was somewhere on set, wandering through a scene. At the time, I remember being shocked and also disillusioned by the disclosure. It changed the way I saw the performance. After my conversation with the director, I went back and rewatched the film, and all I could see was a man with incipient dementia, lost on screen, searching restlessly for his lines, for the words he knew he was meant to be saying. But now, as Xavier walked alongside me, it occurred to me that the performance did remain. That is to say, the performance I experienced the first and even second time I watched the film remained extant, and I thought it was true that a performance existed in the space between the work and the audience, that it existed and was made in that space of interpretation. But then I also thought that if ever an actor had lost sight of the shore, then it was this one. He had stumbled deep into the interior, and I wondered if he worried that he would never find his way out, if the world of fiction had lost its protective powers, the line between reality and invention undone. The confusion and the vulnerability that I had seen on screen was real enough, and I thought again of the panic in the actor's eyes, which was entirely authentic, when he stood in the middle of the set, when he looked at the other actors, the director, for a scrap of paper. In that moment, everything was terribly, terrifyingly real. Because, of course, there was another element to the performance of Salvation, which was death. And although the actor was only in his 60s, as soon as I heard the story of the notes on the counter, the forgotten lines, as soon as I heard this, I was able to envision his death. I was able to imagine the parabolic arc of his decline. I understood that eventually his mind would disintegrate, to the point that his memory of the world and of himself would be lost, and with it, everything that formed his being. It was death. That was what we had responded to when we watched him wading through those scenes on screen, even if we hadn't understood it. The film was a portrait of a man in the process of surrender. I no longer knew how I felt about Salvation, a work I had previously enjoyed in such a pure and naive way. That innocence was gone. I understood all too well what I was seeing. And I wondered also if that wasn't the point of a performance, that it preserved our innocence, that it allowed us to live with the hypocrisies of our desire. Because in fact, we don't want to see the thing itself on a screen or on a stage. We don't want to see actual pain or suffering or death, but its representation. Our awareness of the performance is what allows us to enjoy the emotion, to creep close to it and breathe in its atmosphere. Performance allows this dangerous proximity. Without it, Salvation was only a snuff film. And so I said to Xavier that it did matter. Yes, it did. Without intentionality, there was no agency, no control. The work was happening to you. An impossible inversion. Ah, he said lightly, and he took a sip of coffee. We had arrived at our destination.
There are so many threads in what you just read, and we could begin in any number of them. And if I pull a thread and you don't want to follow that thread, then just go with another. But I think there's so much in this novel, and indeed in all these novels, about I kept thinking of the French term mise en abîme. There's much about the abyss, right? About this sort of gap between the performance and the reality. I think of in A Separation, the mourners, the Greek mourners whom you hire to perform grief for you, and in this novel also this is a quotation. Wife and husband are only words that conceal much more unstable realities, more turbulent than perhaps can be contained in a handful of syllables or any amount of writing. And so there's the idea that not only the stage is a place of performance, but in our relationships, the performance is something always ongoing. Tied to that, this sort of Aristotelian poetics, catharsis is about retaining the consciousness of that separation, the artificiality. So maybe you could say a little bit about you've spoken about how passivity, and that comes up here too, how passivity is something that interests you in protagonists, and yet we wouldn't think of an actress as in any way passive, and we wouldn't. So maybe you could. I am not expressing myself well, but maybe you could sort of address that nexus of performance and passivity and the abyss.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and for saying all those kind things. I mean, I am really interested in passivity, and that is a kind of thread through all three novels to me. You know, I teach at NYU, I teach a writing workshop, and often, you know, a criticism that will come up about a character is that they have no agency. And that is presented as a criticism as if to say, therefore, they are not realistic in some way. And my sense is that very few of us have certainly full agency, but very few of us have very, very much agency at all. And what we do have instead is the illusion of agency. And so I'm always interested in trying to see what happens to narrative when you have characters who are passive, to whom situations happen, and kind of tracing out the consequence of that, and also seeing how narrative changes. So like if you no longer have a character who is activating the scene, what does that mean for narrative? What does that mean for story? What does that mean for the shape of the novel? I think particularly in Intimacies, which is about a simultaneous interpreter who works at a war crimes tribunal and who is literally a kind of conduit for other people's language. That's the other thing, is all three characters speak the words of other people. I was particularly interested in what the kind of ethical consequences of that passivity are, and the degree to which there is, you know, passivity and complicity obviously can go hand in hand. And in the context of that novel in particular, that was the kind of friction that I was interested in. This is a novel that, as you said, she's an actor, so she's more active,
right? I mean, active. It's just in the word, right? It's an interesting. Exactly. She's an actor.
She's more active, but the novel really opens again with a kind of almost a gesture of, maybe it's not passivity, but so the thing, at one point she says the thing she's very good at is delivering what people want. And that she considers a condition of both her employment and also her lifetime as a woman in some way. And she says, I know how to give people what they want. And so then when the novel opens, she's considering whether or not to go in and sit down and have lunch with this kind of troubling young man called Xavier. And somebody opens the door, and she decides, I'm not going to go. And then somebody opens the door, and then out of a sense of courtesy to respond to that cue in a way, she enters, and then the kind of story unfolds from there. So I was interested in somebody who on the surface feels active, but in fact is kind of cycling through various parts that have been very much shaped by culture and by society. And so that, in a sense, I think maybe she's less obviously passive, but I think she is somebody who is operating with this kind of illusion of agency. And so I was interested many, many times in the novel, she kind of finds herself defaulting to expectation, defaulting to the demands that are being placed on her by other people, including the two other central characters in the novel who are her husband and then this young man who's sometimes her son and sometimes not her son. And I was interested in thinking about how her own character comes into being within that. Because in fact, I think she's the only stable character in the novel in a way. The other characters change very much, but she is consistent. And so I was thinking about what does it mean to keep her consistent even as her relationships change.
I mean, it's interesting because the what emerges in the film Salvation, and what makes it so painful, but initially so moving, and then ultimately so unbearable, is that it is some version of authenticity, right? It is some unmediated, unacted, right? So I suppose one of the questions is do you think there's in this character, in this protagonist, is there an unmediated or genuine place, do you imagine? Or is that sort of dance of the seven veils?
It's interesting because I think often when I talk about performance in relation to character, I think people hear that as a negative comment, right? Like so these people don't have authenticity because they're performing a part. But I've always thought about performance, I don't know what this says about me. I've always thought about it differently as a kind of route to authenticity. And so, for example, in a separation, the character, I'm sorry to give the whole plot away, the character is separated from her husband, he goes missing, he dies. She has felt herself to be fully resolved in her relationship with him. She fulfills a promise that she made to him to not tell his parents that they're separated, and she plays the part of a grieving widow. And then over the course of playing this part, she's able to access the reality of what she felt in that relationship, and it changes her understanding of both her marriage and her ex-husband. And so I've always been interested in how performance actually, I mean, this is probably the most basic fake it till you make it, but the kind of like how performance can allow you to access certain real things about who you might be. And I suppose because Audition is very much a book that is concerned with childhood and parenting in some way, you know, in all of my books, I'm very interested in this moment, this kind of uncanny moment when you look at somebody you know very well, and then they appear to you as a stranger, or you see something in them you've never seen before. And one of the things that I thought about a lot when I was writing this book is that the relationship in which that happens with the greatest frequency is often the relationship between child and parent, where a child, even in the first decade of their life, will rapidly transform in this kind of alarming way. But that is seen not as unnatural, but in fact as natural and healthy. And similarly, when you see children learn to become themselves through playing parts, through that is part of the learning process. That is part of how you become a kind of so-called functioning member of society. So I thought that might be a way to kind of look at how the layers of performance and the contradictions are in a way a route through which she's able to access something that is so-called authentic in some way. I mean, I would just say that one of the things about the little movies, the story about this film, Salvation, I think one of the things I was really thinking about was severing the line between, or the kind of thread that connects the authorial intent and the thing itself. So in a lot of ways, the narrative is about, despite the fact that the actor didn't have this interpretation, this intentionality, the audience's interpretation made the performance what it was. And that is something that I wanted to try to do in this book, to kind of relinquish authorial control in some ways and try to write something that would be open to several kinds of interpretation.
So indeterminacy is something I'd love to talk more about. I also, as you're saying that, there's a passage about the narrator's experience of the play and the conversation that she has with Max, the playwright, where Max basically, or certainly the narrator thinks that Max is telling her, you know, this is the key to the part. But what Max says makes no sense at all and she suddenly has this moment of doubt and thinks, this woman has no idea what she's written. She's just fudging it. There's a sort of hole in the middle of the play where and then of course later on, that very same playwright, I mean, we heard the playwright described as a genius, but later on she comes back to the understanding that the play is genius, not least because for her it's been a different experience each time. Yeah. And so I think indeterminacy, and this is maybe linked, I'd love to talk about the openness of the narrative, but I'm also interested in this sort of balance of I say it a lot, balance of freedom and constraint, right? That somehow, if the play were one thing, if the marriage is one thing, if parenting is one thing, then it becomes a trap and of no interest. So, but how do you balance? How do the characters, or in your mind, how do you balance that openness with, at the same time, a need for some sort of consistency?
Yeah, I mean, the question of control is a really interesting one for me in relation to this book in particular. I would say, I mean, I feel like I have a very fraught relationship with authorial control. It's something that I'm that I'm always trying to give up. You know, I think with a separation, this was like my, and so I wrote 2 books in third person and had quite a controlled, overly controlled prose style. And then I started working with a first person voice, and a lot of my interest in that was a loosening of style and kind of taking the risk in a way to write a sentence that wasn't, you know, what I thought was perfect, but that had infelicity.
Perfect.
But that had infelicity. But, you know, I was interested in, like, what does it mean to include infelicities of language? What does it mean to move as a writer, to move beyond just kind of a good prose style in a way, and to give up a little bit of control. And in this novel, I really wanted to give up control, and I wanted to write something that was, I mean, this is a little bit of a silly explanation, but it's the one that I think is the most clear, that was like a rabbit duck. So that, like, you would look at it and you could see a rabbit or you could see a duck in a way.
Like an Escher drawing. I mean, an Escher drawing, the stairs are going up or the stairs are going down.
And I wanted to write something like that, but it actually required quite a lot of control, which was the opposite of what I wanted to explore. But because often, especially in the second half, scenes and sentences would have to have 2 meanings at the same time, all the time, which was probably where the technical challenge of the book lay, in a way. And I think also the question of knowing when you've drifted too far out is an interesting one. I mean, I make the decision to really trust the reader and to hope that the reader understands that I'm trusting them and that they'll follow me. But if they don't, they don't.
Well, you know, earlier when we were just chatting, you said that this book was really fun to write.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in the when you also say it took more control than I had anticipated.
Yeah.
There's I think you've spoken in at least one interview about, it's chapter 7 is the first chapter of the second section.
Yeah.
And that's the one where you're sort of resetting the parameters. And the name of the play changes. And just in that gesture alone, I mean, then there are all sorts of other things that we think, was it? Yeah. But just from that moment, we think, oh, is that just something that at the last minute they changed the name of the play? Or is this a multiverse in which, you know, we're in a slightly different, and so I guess I'm like the person in the audience who doesn't have a question. You're like, can you get to the question, please? Just get to the question already. I guess, what is my question? I guess there's so much in this book to talk about, and so many things that in a way you have seeded or sown for us, right? And I suppose part of it, I wondered if that was the fun, or if the control was the fun, or how was it different from writing these others?
I mean, I'm a great believer that a reader can tell when a writer is taking a risk. And I am drawn to novels where I think the writer does not know if they're going to pull it off. And I find myself shutting down a little bit when I read a novel that is so assured, where I know the novelist started I'm sure I can't actually tell, but sometimes I feel like I can tell when the novelist knows that they can write this novel through to completion without more than greater, standard difficulty. And I think with this book, so I started writing the book in a straightforward, realist, standard way with a single narrative. And I got about 30 pages in, and I thought, I think I can do this through to the end. And I thought that won't be so. It definitely won't be interesting to me, and I actually think it won't be interesting to the reader either. And then, I felt very much that form was not something I played with very much, and it's like one of the great tools that you have as a novelist. And I started thinking about what can I do with structure, and can I use structure in a way to do some of the work that we conventionally associate with plot. So creating momentum, creating tension, opening questions. The middle of the book, the experience of reaching that middle, which I've now ruined for everybody by saying what it is, but like, could it feel like a plot twist where you feel like something has changed, the rules of the game have changed, which is what a plot twist is meant to do. So that was terrific fun, but mostly it was fun because I felt like I was taking a big risk, and the entire time I was writing the book, I kept saying to my husband, who's also a novelist, I kept saying, it really could not, it might not work, it probably won't work, but I know how to do it the other way. And so if it doesn't work, I can go back and I can write it the other way. And something about that felt really liberating, to kind of take something and throw it up in the air a little bit. And it felt very freeing. I think that was why it felt so
I love
fun.
that. That makes total sense. I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking Peter Carey once saying to me, if it doesn't seem impossible, what's the point?
Yeah.
Why would you bother?
Yeah.
You know, I always feel that about undergraduate papers, like just give the notes. If you know what you're going to say, just give the notes to the teacher. They don't want to read the paper. You made the notes, like skip writing the paper. The notes will do, no? Like, but I guess the universities don't agree with that. But I feel like if the novel were written in your head, but it's interesting because in my mind it's almost as though there's an earthquake between part 1 and part 2, and it's the chapter numbers don't begin again. The chapter numbers continue, but it's as if this a sort of bifurcation, but not complete, right? A sort of a change in the register has happened, and as if in between unseen is the scene in the play that the actress has been fretting over. Maybe I don't know how much I'd love to ask you a little about the second half, which seems, although it doesn't take place on stage, has a sort of theatrical quality, and whether that was deliberate on your part.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of open reference. I mean, I think at some point she says it's suddenly her life, like the objects in her home feel like set props, like you pick them up and they're too light, and the walls feel insubstantial. And so the entire second half, which is primarily set in this New York apartment. And I was saying to Claire earlier that I hadn't realized it when I was writing it. I wrote this novel in kind of 2021, 22, 23-ish. But that the second half is really a pandemic novel. There's no masks, viruses, or anything, but it's a novel about children coming home to their parents' house
and
being stuck and not having space and being stuck together and people kind of crawling up the walls. And that was not something I realized until I was done writing the book.
It's perhaps worth saying that Katie does have children, but they have not left home.
They've not left home. They're still very much in the home. This is a.
But there's a line in the novel where the narrator thinks to herself, "We were bigger, we retracted, but surely we must be able to expand again."
But then they are bigger.
Yeah,
they take up more space and they come with other people.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. But I mean, it's so that was definitely something that I wanted to play with the kind of sense of unreality of the second half of the novel.
May I ask you? It's a sort of bigger type of movement that seems to me, has. I think in several reviews or people have commented on the fact, oh, this is your first novel set in the United States. Yeah. It's set in New York, and which is true. Yeah. And yet there your other these certainly in this trilogy, but also your first two novels. I mean they've been set elsewhere. These ones in Europe, but I would say there's still a sense of alienation from America. This doesn't feel, and I mean, I know we all say like New York isn't the United States. Yeah. I mean, whatever. But I wondered. I wanted to ask you about again on the freedom and constraint about deracination and versus a rootedness and perhaps both within the fictions and how you consider yourself. I mean, I think of these in a way as European novels, as I mean, not just because of where they're set, but because of how they feel. And I don't know whether that's something that is conscious in you, or a complexity of identity?
I'm sure. I mean, I'm the only person in my family who was born in the United States, and
Me
then
too.
really,
Yeah.
of course, I knew that. And then I think my parents also had a slightly unusual immigration story in that they moved to the United States and they lived in the United States for 15 years, and then they went back to Japan. And at the time, I remember I was like, "You've lived here for 15 years. How can you possibly leave?" And now 15 years as an adult, I realize it's just nothing. It's like that was a period of their life, but they had another life somewhere else, and they returned to that life. And I think that has really affected the way I tell stories in some fundamental way. I think it's also, they didn't know, my dad was an engineering professor. They didn't know the American canon. They didn't know the Western canon at all. And they just gave me, it was really a mishmash. And I read a lot of Japanese fiction in translation, but also just a lot of different things. So I think, I encountered the canon such as it were when I went to college, I think, and I studied English, and I took really many, many, many classes, and I, like, as a good committed Asian student, did everything. But in some way, it wasn't rooted in my childhood in some way. So I think there was a way in which, I wasn't oriented towards American culture in some very, very fundamental way, I think. And that probably shows in this book. I mean, these characters are living in New York. I think in part I felt comfortable doing that because in both A Separation and Intimacies, I think I was relying to a certain extent on location to create this sense of alienation that the narrators feel within their, to the world and their place in the world. But here I knew I wanted it to be internal, and I wanted it to be kind of manifest in the structure of the book itself in some way. But they're both not really from here in some fundamental way, I think. Both the narrator and her husband.
And her husband.
Yeah.
And possibly, I mean,
Who knows?
the Xavier is
yes.
I mean, not a common.
Yes, exactly. And then there's a fourth character who's called Hana, which is like a Japanese name, but it also has other meanings in different languages. And her mother is Japanese, and she's also a character who's kind of in some way not from there. And it is a novel about kind of creating myths of family and play acting and enacting family as a mythology.
Right. Absolutely. It seems so much about the world as we live in it now, right? Which is that, I used to, it's now more complicated to invoke Alice Munro, but I used to say, of Alice Munro that she lived in the house, not quite the house where she was born, but 2 blocks away, that was a rooted life, that the histories of, streets and those were known, and sort of Salman Rushdie being sort of at the other end, with his essay, Imaginary Homelands, which is, a famous essay from long ago now, but this idea that the minute you leave home, and always in your work, the characters have a complexity of identities and histories,
And I think home is a complicated, I mean, it's kind of, in some ways I thought it was more explicit in Intimacies, because I think the character says something like, I don't know, I want to go home. But I mean, Audition is completely about home.
Yes.
It's just a scary home.
Scary. It gets scary. It doesn't seem, at first it's like, and we have this ritual of nice breakfast.
Yeah.
It gets a little scarier. It gets a little, gets a little fraught. I also, there was something I wanted just quickly. I know we're going to open it up to the audience in just a minute, but I wanted to ask also, because you, as some of you may know, for a long time, Katie was a dancer. And I think when you were sort of 16, probably thought you would be a dancer. There were moments, there are moments in all the novels, but there were certainly moments in this one where I was reminded of Jean Rhys's Quartet. This sort of, which always has to me a dance-like feeling. I don't know if you're familiar with that novel, but there are these intimate relations, and everybody has a relation to each other character that then there's something some exchange and it's altered, or you're aware of it changing. So it is, even though this is about the theater, I don't think of it as theatrical, because I think of it in terms of movement somehow. And I wondered whether other art forms like theater, like dance, whether they were ever in your mind as you were writing.
Yeah, I love Jean Rhys so much. I mean, I think choreography was very much front of mind when I was writing this.
I guess that's what I mean.
Yeah, writing this book, in the sense that, I mean, there's an English theater director called Declan Donnellan, and he had, which is maybe a common thing to say about staging, but he was kind of saying, meaning in a play is not created in the text, it's created in the space between the actors and how you organize that space. And so that was something that I thought about, mostly in this. I mean, there's almost nothing on stage in the novel, so mostly in the scenes that are off stage, depending on how you read it. But the form that was really influential on this book was film, because, and I would love to know from the audience, because I think I must be wrong, but it felt to me that there are so many movies that do have a bifurcated structure. And I can rattle them off quite quickly. Like Vertigo would be one, Lost Highway would be another, Apichatpong Veerasattakul's Tropical Malady would be another. There's just a lot of films, Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express, thank you. Yeah, there's just this kind of notion of this hard reset in the middle of a narrative is not uncommon in film. And I found it hard to find the equivalents in novels as immediately. And certainly, there must be.
I'm sure there are.
There will be.
Audience? Asymmetry.
Asymmetry was a novel that I thought about. Fates and Furies, Lauren Groff's novel as well.
Yep.
But I think for me, the novels, the works of art that were most influential was certainly Vertigo, which is about doubles and performance and hauntings in so many ways. Persona by Bergman.
Right.
I mentioned earlier Joseph Losey's The Servant. And then above all, Lost Highway by David Lynch, which if you watch it, you'll see I more or less stole the structure for that. But the theft felt easier because it was a different medium.
Well, I also think that's what writers do. Is, I mean, you're a magpie. We take. But you take this flower and that shoe and and then it's something
and then you
new.
put the flower in the shoe and
then
hope
it's something new.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I know, I'm sure there are many questions, and I don't want to. I can keep going, but yes. And could I ask you to wait until Mary comes with the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful reading and this really wonderful discussion. My name is Eek Stamuri, and I'm a Radcliffe Fellow this year in Literature and Poetry. And I was so delighted by the initial section of your reading when you're talking about this actress, where the actress is talking about how she's trying to locate the center of her role. And her friend asks her, well, what if you're just still good and you don't feel it? And that linked up for me with the later discussion of how a death scene in fiction requires a kind of intentionality and control so that it doesn't become a snuff film and become something that simply happens to the viewer, but the viewer can gravitate close to this extreme experience. And I was thinking about that sensation of polish and finish in a book. So when you're talking about the actress, I was thinking about, or the actor, I was thinking about writing. And I was thinking that having that sensation of, I have done it, I like what I have done, I feel like I have finished this book in a way that is satisfactory to me, was connected to your concept of passivity, so that the book is not something that is happening to you, but you are driving it, you are the executive, and so in some fashion can adequately and maybe even ethically bring the reader through an extreme or even comical experience. And then I thought, well, maybe this reliance upon our discretion and judgment is is an illusion. And it's really not the best index. And then I was so interested when you were talking about how you yourself were looking to give up control during the writing process. When you were giving up control, were you also releasing the need to have that final sensation of finish?
Right. I mean, thank you so much for that. I feel like I never want to be I never feel really done. I never feel done with a book, and I also never feel good about a book. I mean, I've just never had the experience of. I don't know if other writers have this feeling. Like I never feel good about. I never read a section of it and think that was good. It's just like I'm always like, oh, I guess that's that. Is very much how I feel. But I think. But what I do know is how I read, and I know that I make 40% of a book up, I think, and so the example I always give is Portrait of a Lady, which I first read when I was 19, which I thought was about. I thought the first half of the book was what that book was about, and then I read it when I was much older, and I was like, this is about the second half of the, and of course it's both those things, and I think understanding that led me to understand the kind of essential mutability of a text, that like a good novel is hopefully infinitely capacious and changes all the time and changes depending on who's reading it and when they're reading it. And I think part of what I've also learned, I think a lot of this comes from teaching, is understanding that sometimes a book doesn't seem, or a text doesn't seem good to me because I'm not the right reader for it. And what my job is as a teacher is making myself the right reader for it, so I can understand the ambitions and the message of the book in some way, and do that empathetic work to then try to help the writer write that book. I feel like when I first started teaching, I was like, you should do it the way I would do it. But that's not actually what reading taste is. I don't think. I think when I was a younger person, a much younger person, which was true once, I think I thought of almost my taste in reading is almost like a feather in my cap, like it was a kind of aesthetic sensibility that said something good about who I was as a person. And I think I've become much looser in my understanding of that, and therefore become a more generous reader. And I think that sense of the potential generosity of the reader is what allowed me to write something that I think felt more open in a way, in the hope that the reader will be willing to bring that 40% and kind of complete the book in a way. So it is, I mean, thus it's been interesting because people do read the book very, very differently. And a lot of it often has to do with quite personal things about their lives and their life situation. I don't feel like I've answered your question, though. Is that okay? I'm sorry. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. When we were talking about books, I thought of Trust Exercise and didn't say that out loud as one that has sort of a rupture. But I was interested in what you were saying at the beginning, both about flipping the gender tropes and narratives and also what you were saying about passivity, because I feel like in a misogynistic world, like the expectation would be that a woman is passive. And so whether you would ever write like a male protagonist that's passive, or whether there's something particularly interesting about keeping it a passive woman in your writing.
So my first novel has only male characters, and it's an extremely passive male character who's just sleepwalking into a bad situation. So that was actually where I started.
I've only read these two.
No. But it's an interesting question for something to do in the future, for sure. I mean, I think there is something about the gender dynamic and passivity and the kind of assumptions of activity and agency that are interesting to me. But I'm also I think it's of course equally a trap for men, and I think it is one of the kind of tragedies of masculinity. And so I am interested in that, and I thought about that a lot in my first book. I mean, one of the reasons that Blue Velvet sorry, this does sound random, and I apologize, but because
David
I just
Lynch.
mentioned, but David Lynch. I think Blue Velvet is a great film because it is about the kind of like tragedy of these characters who are caught trying to enact a kind of masculinity that they know is hollow in some way, and who feel compelled to be active in some way. And that's why, to me, that's one of the reasons why the film is so extraordinary. But I am for sure interested in it within the domain of masculinity as well. Yeah.
Maybe over here, high up. I mean, it's interesting. We just tied in. I mean, there's this question of the self and society is something. How you navigate an identity between those, between the self and society.
I mean, I think like that's. I mean, for me, one of the reasons why it was so fun to write. I should stop using the word fun because it's immaterial to the reader whether I had fun writing it. But I mean, one of the things that I liked writing about Intimacies is because it was set in this very particular work location of this war crimes tribunal. It meant that you could think quite directly about the interplay between the individual and a larger social structure and kind of look at it directly through the mechanism of this one institution.
I read in an interview you gave that you'd been reading Ibsen and Pinter and other playwrights while preparing this book. Yeah. And I was curious if you'd thought about writing this story as a play or writing a play in the future or inserting a play as a chapter in a novel. And even if the answer is no, I wanted to ask you, do you think there's something that prose fiction can reveal about performance that theater can't?
Oh.
Good question.
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I mean, I've never written theater. I've written a lot of unproduced scripts, which is something completely different. I mean, I think the constraints of theater are very, very different to writing a screenplay. And I would be very intimidated to do it. It seems to me like a very magical form. And I feel like I think I read a tiny bit of a description of it, but of this young playwright's work, which is drawing a little bit from, I saw I saw a production of Annie Baker's The Aliens and Dane DeHaan was in it at the Rattlestick in New York. And this was, I don't know what year it was, but it was just one of these moments when something happened in this space, and it was completely extraordinary, and I don't know why it happened, and I couldn't point to it, and it has stayed with me for decades longer. I mean, I saw Declan Donnellan did an extraordinary production in Russia of The Three Sisters, and it was transformative. Do I think that the fiction has anything to add to that? Very good question. One of the magical things about theater is it's a physical space where people are together for a contained period of time, which is not how people consume fiction on the whole. But I'm really interested in my fiction in thinking about spaces and how they, of contained spaces, like whether it is a boxing ring or a courtroom or the space of a theater, like a stage, where these are spaces that are completely artificial, that have clear borders and boundaries, that have rules, regulations, traditions, conventions, rituals, parts that everybody plays, and yet in the middle of that you touch upon something that is real, and that happens, whether it's in sports or in theater or in a courtroom, it does happen. And that to me is what fiction tries to do, is that this is all fake. It's start, middle, end, none of it is real, and yet you hope maybe in the middle of it, something real might happen for like a half a second. And that's the kind of, I think, the aspiration that you have as a writer. So that's the only kind of point of connection. I knew I was never going to write a play in the middle of this novel. I think it's something that a lot of people have done really well. It just was not interesting to me. There's also something in the structure of the book where I think it is, one possible interpretation of it is that one or other of the halves of the play is itself sorry, half of the novel is itself a play, because there's a second play that's revealed at the end of the book. So I thought, it would, if I also had like a play, but then also the thing is the play, it just felt like it wouldn't work. So,
Many plays.
a lot of plays.
Oh, okay, great. I was wondering if you could say a little something about the relationship of the novel to the adultery novel and the adultery plot, because it seems like one of the setups in the beginning is that we think this is going to be adultery. It then turns out that there is a history of adultery. That's the setup for the nice breakfast ritual that we have. It was a kind of one-off apology. And then it kind of comes out in a few different ways over the course of the novel, but it never becomes this sort of central plot. And then I have a very specific language question, which is, this is the first novel that I've read that uses the construction of giving plus noun, as in like it's giving X. Xavier is described as giving son, and it's used sort of twice in a row. So it's clear that this is a like contemporary locution. So I was just really interested in your choice to put that in the novel, and whether like your editor had a comment about it or anything.
It's funny, they never said anything about it. I think I put it in there because it felt a little vulgar, it felt crass in a way, and I think so. It's a moment when the character of this young man is giving good son to multiple women at the same time, and there's a kind of promiscuity to it, and there's a kind of sense of, even though in the first half of the book the central character is like, you're I don't know you, stop being like this, it's still discomforting to her when he sees him perform the exact same thing and do it with such ease with anybody. And I think the particularity of the experience then is drained away, and there's something about it. So I think I wanted to use something that was a little on the crass side, particularly for the language of the character, so that it would show that actually it's an irritation, it's something that troubles her more than she's willing to admit. And I think it also comes at a moment when she's like quite stressed out, and so everything about her is is grumpy. But no, my editor did not queer the only thing that they really didn't want in there was the word post-it, and I don't know why. So they were all post-it notes, and then they kept getting, and then they would put stuck notes, and then I would add back in post-it notes, and then they would come out again.
It's a name brand?
I think so, and there's no other brand names in the novel, so I think it was actually not.
When I was in college and Peter Matheson taught our creative writing class, he came in and he said, I have 2 things to teach you. I've been teaching for 30 years and nobody I've taught has ever been published. and the other thing I have to teach you, is don't use brand names if you want your work to last. So they retained that lesson.
They retained
Your
that
editors
lesson.
retained that lesson. No brand names.
They retained that lesson. I mean, the infidelity novel is something that I love writing for some reason. My husband would ask why, I'm sure. And a separation is really, really that is. But one thing that I thought very much is that, so a separation is about the end of a marriage, and Intimacies is about the start of a relationship, and this novel is about the middle. And I was really interested in the middle because it doesn't have, I guess this is like my perversity in not wanting to write characters with agency or who are very active and who activate the scene all the time. When you write about the end, when you write about the beginning, it's like, are they going to get together? When you write about the end, it's like, are they going to stay together or not? And I thought in the middle, there's those, you don't have that automatic narrative pressure and stakes are not there for you. And then on the one hand, you can look at it like, well, then how do you create tension or create interest in the relationship? But then I also thought, what does it open up space for? And my sense is very much that the middle of life is still very turbulent in my sense of it. And it was interesting when Intimacies came out, the central character is in her late 30s, but she was described all the time, repeatedly, as a young woman, takes a job, goes to The Hague to work as a simultaneous interpreter. And I thought that's really interesting that we still associate narrative and story as something that happens to young people. But it sadly continues to happen throughout your life. So I was interested in writing about the middle, and I think these I never wanted it to be a question whether or not the husband and wife would stay together, and I didn't want it to be a question of whether or not they loved each other, but I wanted to create the kind of turbulence that their marriage survives, which is why it is a strong marriage. And I guess infidelity is maybe one of the obvious buttons that you can press. So she's unfaithful in the first half, and then she's not faithful, and she is faithful in the second half. And so there's also this kind of constant constellation in which she's looking for a third.
I found myself thinking of the relationship between Christopher's parents in a separation. In the narrator and Thomas here, that sense of the time a lot of time has accrued, and again the sort of dance or struggle seems too strong a word, but between fixity and movement.
Yes.
Right? Do we have the same breakfast every day? Or do we, maybe never, no, this is how you get old, is you have the same breakfast every day. Let's not have the same breakfast.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you may have read the interview and know that Katie hates
It's not like breakfast. Yes.
I think do we have time for maybe one more question? Here.
Thank you so much. I loved hearing about those films that you referenced in terms of the two-part structure with the plot twist in the middle. And I was curious just generally if films overall influence your writing and what that looks like. Like, do you specifically seek out specific films as reference for structure and character and things like that? Or is it more a general inspiration? But would just love to hear more.
I mean, so I didn't do an MFA, and I've never taken a writing course. But what I did do is I worked on a 3-part documentary series for British television that was about psychoanalysis in cinema, and it was presented by Slavoj Žižek, and it was directed by a very good friend of mine called Sophie Fiennes. Somebody's laughing. Called The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, which is, and he does these kind of extraordinary Lacanian readings of classic, everything from kind of Terminator to Blue Velvet to Psycho, there's a huge range. And something about, and so I worked on that, I must have been in my 20s. It was before I was writing fiction, but for a period of I think we were working on it for a couple of years then there was another one after that as well. This was the time when terrestrial television would commission 200 minutes of Lacanian analysis of art house cinema, which is like a vanished era. That era does not exist anymore. But I watched movies like as work, and I really accessed them through this very, very particular kind of theoretical lens. And the thing is, I think it did give me a kind of apparatus for understanding not even character, but narrative and how narrative structure operates and the kind of layers within it. And that was really, that's really, really, really in a separation. This kind of Lacanian idea of interpassivity, for example, is something that is in the book itself, in this figure of the mourners who are kind of actively expressing the emotion on behalf of other people. So there a lot of that finds its way into the book. So it's a combination of films, but also that very particular window into it. But I think there's also, my books are quite short, and you could read them in 2 hours, I think, if you wanted to.
Could you read them in the dark with popcorn?
That's the thing.
Well, I guess we have to stop. We probably do. Well, Katie Kitamura, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you so much.